Hello, listeners. Very excited to be speaking to you for our inaugural episode of the European Chamber podcast. My name is Jacob Gunter. I'm the European Chamber's Senior Policy and Communications Manager, and I'm here with my co-host, Tom. Tom, can you quickly introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Jacob. Yeah, my name is Tom Groot. I am Policy and Communications Coordinator here at the Chamber, and thank you very much for allowing me to be on the first ever podcast.
And thanks as well to our colleague, Zhang Yicher, who is sort of the master of recording and editing. He does all the logistics behind the scenes. So today we'll be talking about a very important issue for European companies in China, which is whether or not they can get their foreign talent back into China with all of those who had already left previously earlier in the year due to the pandemic. So first, Tom and I will have a quick discussion about some recent policy changes from the Chinese side about returnees specifically coming from Europe. And then after that, we'll have our main segment where we'll have a couple of guests on. We'll be speaking with Massimo Bagnasco, one of the vice presidents of the European Chamber, who returned from Italy in July, as well as Carl Hayward, my boss, who returned from Hong Kong in August. We'll be discussing with, amongst the three of us, sort of the general experience of applying for things, getting all the approvals that you needed, the flight itself, the quarantine, and sort of some tips on quarantine and how to kind of reintegrate with society. All right, so first, before we have our additional guests on the show, I'm actually going to sit down with my colleague Tom, and we're going to discuss briefly some recent changes that we saw in August regarding the ability for foreigners to return to China, specifically from different European countries. So as a reminder for our listeners, back on the 28th of March, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the National Immigration Administration suspended the ability for foreign nationals that were holding valid visas and residence permits and such from being able to return to China. And since then, it's been very challenging for people to come back. But as said, on the 10th of August, something changed. So Tom, can you give us a bit of elaboration on what specifically changed?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much. So on August 10th, several embassies that were based in Europe published a notice on their website saying that people that have valid work permits or residence permits or have spousal visas can reapply for their visas to return visa free of charge at any Chinese embassy or consulate in those countries. And previously you needed a PU letter, an invitation letter from Ministry of Foreign Affairs to return, and that has proven to be rather hard. And the change basically right now is that you don't need those anymore, it appears to be. So that is a change. It is welcomed, of course, by us. Let's hope that a lot of people can return from those countries, indeed.
Yeah. So as our listeners will hear later from our guests, the process for getting this PU, this invitation letter. But yes, as we'll hear later, it was quite the difficult process to obtain this. So another question, Tom. People from these different countries, these different European countries, which are mostly the EU member states, plus Norway, Switzerland, and quite a few of the Balkan states. The notice said that they're able to return, but tangibly, does that mean a Canadian living in Germany or a Swede living in Mexico, would they be able to return to China?
There are a couple of conditions that those people need to comply by, and it's basically the first being that they need to be national of those countries that are listed. It's an entire list. Please look at our website for the full stands and all the names of the countries. So they need to be nationals of those countries, and also they need to be residing in those countries. So it is not possible for a Canadian residing in Europe to come to China to reapply for the visa. And it's also not possible for a European national living or residing in a country outside of Europe to apply for a similar visa to come back to China.
Yeah. I mean, I know this is quite frustrating for a lot of our members because European companies are global companies. They like to draw on talent pools from all over the world. If you have a Danish company, that's a big MNC, they're almost certainly going to have non-European nationals that have been working in China, but they were pulled back to headquarters back at the start of the pandemic. And now, even though they've been working in the same office as their European national colleagues, if they're trying to return back to China, they're viewed as, I guess, higher risk, essentially, despite the fact that they would have, the same level of risk, having literally worked in the same office together. Tom, what about foreign nationals, foreign residents in China had a residency permit, but that permit expired during, the last several months that they've been outside of China. Are they able to return?
They're not, no. That's one of the things that we are constantly monitoring, but at this point, only people with still valid work permits, residence permits, or spousal visas can reapply for visas. If they are expired, they have to wait for further announcements.
And I know another concern that a lot of our members have is, not for their companies, but for their families to be able to return, but also for their families and their children to be able to attend school. We have an awful lot of international schools here that rely very heavily on non-European teachers, mostly native English speakers. And so right now the UK is the only native English-speaking country on this list. And so if you have Americans, Canadians, Australians that aren't able to return, and these are important people for these international schools. All right, Tom, what other kind of bottlenecks might exist out there beyond just, getting the return visa?
Yeah, well, there are two major bottlenecks that we see currently. And the first one is the capacity of the visa offices in the European countries, because they haven't been on full capacity at all. Some even have only been open for 1 day a week. So if you want to reapply, you might have to wait a couple of weeks in order to be able to get your visa. The other one is, of course, the number of flights to China. As we all know, there is the number of flights have not returned to normal yet. So there's only 1 or maybe 2 flights per country going to China per week, which is very few. So that is something that we also want to address to the Chinese government over and over again, is that we would like to see the number of flights increase for our foreign experts, foreign talents to be able to return to China.
Excellent. Well, yeah, thank you, Tom, for giving us this nice kind of in-depth look at this new policy change and sort of what it tangibly means for the many European business people that are trying to come back to China. All right, moving into part 2 of our episode. We're quite honored to have 2 guests on from the chamber itself. We have our colleagues Massimo and Carl. Massimo, Carl, can you quickly introduce yourselves?
Thank you, Jacobs. I'm Massimo Bagnasco. I'm Vice President of the European Chamber of Commerce, as well as managing partner of an Italian SME operating in China since 2004.
Thanks, Jacob. My name's Carl Hayward. I'm General Manager of the European Chamber's Beijing chapter and also Director of Communications.
So Massimo was stuck in Italy earlier on this year after the borders closed, and Carl was stuck in Hong Kong. I myself actually came back from the United States on May 16th. So I got back before the border closed, but literally the same day that they instituted new rules for mandatory hotel quarantine. So I won't be able to speak much to the experience of trying to come back and getting all the paperwork sorted out and such, and the uncertainty. But it'll be interesting to sort of compare our different quarantine experiences as well later on. So first, let's start with why were you stuck outside of China when this happened? And we'll start with Massimo.
I flew back to Europe in late January. It was an already planned trip because of the usual Brekelon Spring Festival, the mission we plan as a chamber every year to Brussels. And then the outbreak became quite heavy in China, so I let my family member also join me in Italy. And then we missed the chance to get back to China on the 13th of March for some family reason, and we got stuck there. It was a very long experience, and was really touching from a certain point of view. The main, situation that we faced was the uncertainty about when and even if we could get back to China, even if we carry a resident permit. My wife is Chinese. My kids are half Italian, half Chinese in terms of nationality. So this one was definitely one of the main challenge that we face, and was really touching. Then I can maybe say something later more about it. Yeah.
Yeah, great. What about you, Carl?
I originally left Beijing on the 23rd of January. The plan was to go to Hong Kong for Chinese New Year and spend 5 days there. And things progressed fairly rapidly. And because of the outbreak escalating, I decided I wasn't going to travel because I'm actually a high-risk case, having had a serious case of pneumonia before and also 2 collapsed lungs on different occasions. So I figured I would stay in Hong Kong and sort of wait for the worst to pass before coming back. So I was working remotely. The plan at that point was to be there for just 2 weeks, maybe, until what I thought things would die down. While I was in Hong Kong, unfortunately, we had a fairly serious family incident and I had to return home to the UK. I was there for 2 weeks and the plan was then I was going to return to Hong Kong, pick up some of the things that I'd left and come straight back to Beijing. Unfortunately, the day we arrived in Hong Kong was the last day, in fact, that they were accepting non-Hong Kong residents into Hong Kong before shutting their borders down. So in some respects, I was lucky. I got back in the nick of time, but it also meant that I was then trapped in Hong Kong for the foreseeable future. And again, I echo what Massimo says. It was the uncertainty. Things happened very, very quickly. You were never quite sure what was going to happen next. But I think in the early days, there was always a sense of this is only going to be for a few days. We can cope, we can sit this out, let's just see how things develop. And things did develop, but probably not how I was expecting them to.
I certainly shared that that sort of sense of getting caught in sort of the machinations of policymakers and such myself. And I felt like the unluckiest person in the world when I landed in Beijing and was told that I had to quarantine in a government facility at my own expense, and no one explained what that meant. But of course, it only took a few days after that to realize I was kind of the luckiest person on earth to have gotten back while I could. And so I didn't have to face the same kind of uncertainty that you and your families faced. So Massimo, you mentioned you wanted to kind of elaborate a little bit more on that.
I mean, the worst time came, let's say, in early April, when the operation, basically the business operation in China started again. As I mentioned, I ran a small medium enterprise, around 20 people staff, not so many. Few of them, 5 of them are European, so they were stuck too. And day by day, the feeling get harder and harder. I have the people here, they feel abandoned. They feel alone. There are several action and operation which need my physical presence, but also they were looking for me as their guide, as their mentor, also for the professional activity that we do. And honestly speaking, I really felt myself in a jail. You know, several people in Europe said, "Oh, the lockdown was nice. We stay with family and so on." And I was lucky. I stayed with my family, but I can tell you, I wasn't able to sleep at night over 4 a.m. because I feel really the needs to communicate with my team, to stay close to them, and I was too nervous. And so living in this situation since, let's say, April, May, June, until when I got the chance to get back, was really a unique experience from really the perception that you can have when you are far away from your business, from your people. You wish to help them, but you can't. And I mean, really personally, it touched me a lot because even in Italy, I am a resident in foreign countries, so I could not enjoy many of the rights that you have as a citizen. But the country where I live in the last 16 years, where I have a wife, where my kids were born, would not accept me. This was something, I mean, taking in consideration all the necessary, health measure to preserve and protect the local people was something really I could not understand and accept from, China, which is nowadays a world economic power and so on. So it was something that really touched me a lot.
No, certainly. What about you, Carl, being down? You were staying with your brother, right?
I think I was lucky in some respects. First of all, unlike Massimo, I was in the same time zone. So actually being able to work and keep in contact with colleagues was easier from that respect. I was also lucky in that I was able to stay with my brother. I think I was also unlucky in the respect that I was able to stay with my brother. There was obviously a lot of tension. The flats in Hong Kong aren't the largest. We were in very close quarters. We actually, when we returned from the UK together, we were both having to do 2 weeks of quarantine. And it does test the limits of your relationship. Even though I'm very, very close to him, it was a trying time. Unlike Massimo, I was in the same time zone. But even having said that, I think the sense of removal from what was really going on, I think there's been some incredible adaptation of work practices that has taken place using digital platforms to try and keep things going to the most normal extent that you possibly can. But then there is still, I think, particularly in our organization, a real need for personal contact. The ability to be able to see people face to face really does make a difference, particularly when you're talking about details to do with the publications, which is one of the major things that we do here. I think you just feel very, very removed from actually what is taking place, and I think that was difficult for me, and I think I struggled with it for the entire time. And I think now being back, I feel a sense that it's not just a physically closer to people, but there's also another type of closeness, which I'm feeling now.
I mean, if I can jump in, I mean, what you mentioned about the needs to be in physical contact, face-to-face view with people, it's definitely a must. I mean, especially if you operate in the service sector or in a kind of organization as the chamber. I mean, I saw the difference really when I landed back to China. Along this month, I try really to keep in contact with all my clients, all my business partner, almost on daily basis. But we are very kind, very polite, very supportive about the situation, caring how things going on, but no one was talking about business. No one was talking about business, because they have the same concern that I have. When and if you will be back. So no meaning to talk about something if you are not here. If maybe even your company will be not more in operation. But the day I landed back, I make a post in WeChat. Can you believe that the same day I got over 100 messages and calls from people say, wow, you are back. See you in 2 weeks' time. So this is make the difference. This is, made myself even more concerned about the time lost in some way when I was blocked far away. And especially, when I had many pushback coming back just because the size of my company. My company has many others which operate in this country. It's a small, medium enterprise which contribute really with peanuts in the terms of tax revenue to this country. But I can tell you from my personal experience of my staff, even staff that left my company, they always back to me and said, Massimo, we have a great experience from a personal point of view and from the professional one. So this is something we should consider when we talk about SME. It's not just a matter of how much tax you bring, but it's also a matter of how you let professional really grow up from the personal, individual point of view and professional. This is an added value really we should pay attention to and we should value properly.
Yeah, and I think one thing I've experienced when I go around and I meet with our members, including our SMEs, is that they're bringing high-end technology and expertise and know-how, but they also provide good middle-class and high-income jobs, and good opportunities for skilled workers and such. These aren't just kind of cheap minimum wage positions. They're providing really niche values, and these are the kinds of positions and jobs that I think a lot of Chinese people aspire to. So there's that additional value brought by SMEs that is kind of diminished by overlooking them when you're looking at who can and can't come back. All right, so moving more now to sort of the nitty-gritty details. I think a lot of our listeners are probably keen to learn a little bit about the sort of documentation that was necessary, the sort of approvals, the inconsistencies, things like this. And As my co-host Tom and I already discussed at the first part of the show, that has changed now. For people with a legitimate and valid residence permit to be able to come back to China. But of course, everyone else still needs to go through the same or at least similar processes to what you two did. So let's start with Massimo. What were some of the big steps that you had to go through to be able to come back?
Yeah, I mean, I came back with the, let's say, old model. So when a PU letter was requested as a first step to be able to apply for the new visa, even if I have, as I said, a resident permit valid since several years. And so that one was the main issue because, I mean, my company tried to apply for it, but the answer was no, because you have no enough tax revenue, no, because you are not planning to invest in Beijing. And this was something, I mean, how to say, amazing. When the first time my HR manager met with the official of Invest Beijing, and the question they asked her was, how much are you planning to invest this year? And she said, sorry, what are you saying? She said, look, if my managing director and my colleague will not back, we will shut down the company. We are not thinking, we are thinking to survive nowadays, not invest. So these are some of the points. Then luckily, because just because my position in the chamber, I was able to get the letter. Even for my son. This is another point. I mean, my wife is Chinese. My daughter, she carry a travel permit issued by the Chinese authority, but my son is full Italian. And so the main concern at the time was, okay, I can get invited, but what about him? We will leave him alone in Italy? Because even, and this is really surprising, my wife could not take him back. Okay. This is really something which let me think a lot. How is possible that you don't allow to a Chinese citizen to take back his son, his daughter, because he carry another nationality passport? So there were several contradictions when you are living for months in a frustrated situation that can really impact on you. Anyway, I got the letter. Very smooth process for the visa in a week time, and luckily on July 3rd I land back to China in Nanjing, and I experienced my 2 weeks holiday. I can say holiday in Nanjing.
Well, yeah, thanks. That's a very interesting kind of overview of that. And looking over at Carl, of course our listeners can't see this, but he has a giant stack of approval forms and documents with stamps on them and things like this. So, Carl, what about your experience sort of differed from Massimo's?
I think we shared a similar experience to begin with, in that we were both not in the prioritized groups of people to get the PU letters in order to come back. In Massimo's case, it was because of the size of his company. In my case, it's because I'm not actually a part of a corporate organization at all, in fact. But I was led to believe that I would just have to sit and wait things out. And it wasn't until a regular meeting that we had when we were getting updates from HR and our government affairs department talking about our members, actually, who were applying for PU letters, who'd been put onto the list to be put forward by the European Chamber for approval, that I just happened to mention almost offhand, what about adding me to the list? And head of government affairs agreed, said she'd give it a go and see what happened. And so I went through the process along with everybody else. I think, in fact, myself and Massimo were both privileged from the respect that we were brought up, our names were brought up, especially in the meetings, and it was explained that we were needed for chamber operations. And in Massimo's case, obviously, he needed to get back for commercial reasons as well. And I think we actually received our PU letters around about the same time. I think I got mine. It was mid-June, I think,
Yeah,
when I was
between
awarded
10 to
mine.
15. Yeah.
And my perhaps naive assumption at that point was that, well, that's it, bingo. I'm back to Beijing in a couple of weeks. But of course, that wasn't the case. I mean, I can elaborate more about the actual experience of the kind of administrative hurdles that I had to leap in order to get back. So that was really just the beginning of the process. I mean, of course, a very important part, but by no means the end was not in sight. This was, of course, needed to apply for the visa, and in order to do so, you had to go to a website where it tells you the documentation that you need to support it. You had to include a photograph and the usual things that you would applying for a visa to come to China from any other part of the world. I arrived at the visa center nearly 3.5 weeks later because you had to make an appointment. This was one of the things that had changed due to the COVID situation. They were only accepting appointments that had been made via the website. You couldn't just turn up. And there was such a backlog, I'm guessing because there was suddenly a rush of people that were all waiting to get their visas, that 3.5 weeks later I finally managed to get an appointment. When I did, the first thing they told me was that the form that I'd filled in was the old version, even though it came from their website, and that there was also additional documentation that I needed, including an invitation letter from my company, and a negative COVID test. There was a couple of other things as well, photocopies of my passport, etc. That could actually be done fairly quickly. The letter I managed to get from the chamber relatively quickly as well. The COVID test I actually managed to get within 4 days, although it cost around about 1,500 Hong Kong dollars altogether, which I think is about 8 times the cost of what it was costing in mainland China around that time. When I finally had all the documentation that I managed to get another appointment just a week later, actually. They allowed me to come back because I'd already had an initial appointment. And it was at that point they started to pick through my application, find fault with certain things, including the wording on the document that I'd received from the chamber inviting me back, where it stated that they would like me to come back for work purposes. And they said that because this is a business visa, it should mention it's for business purposes. So again, they were really looking into fine details that started to make me think that it was really just they were putting up bureaucratic barriers just to prevent people from coming back too quickly. The letter was eventually corrected, and then when I went back for a third appointment, they pointed to a section on the application where it says, please enter more information that you feel would help to support your application. And said, you need to write in this point here that you understand that your residence permit will be cancelled and you understand that you don't know how long this whole process will take. When I argued with the lady behind the desk that wouldn't actually support my application, she said, well, you either do it or this process is basically going to stop here. So I had to write, even though we'd already been given assurances from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that residence permits, valid residence permits would not be cancelled, I was asked to put it in writing that it would. I'm guessing as a get-out clause for them that should something change further down the line, that they had it from me in writing acknowledging that I was relinquishing my permit. So these were just the initial stages that I had to go through before the visa application was actually accepted.
It's very interesting because, my personal experience was totally different, much easier for the visa application. As soon as I received the PO, I sent an email to the Chinese consulate in Milan and to the visa center. I got a reply in 2 hours' time. They're telling me, tell us when you want to come here. I said, tomorrow? Fine, tomorrow. And they received me very smooth, and I said, so why? I said, look, we never received yet a PO letter from Beijing. So I said, well, so it was really an exceptional case for them, so they treated it in the best way. But then the other step, more complicated, was about the flight, because I have a flight reservation with Etihad, seems to me, but the flight was cancelled. Luckily, it came out a charter flight organized by the Italian Chamber, the Italian embassy, and so I was able to get back, and then, as I said, we got back to here. So, but was kind of interesting time also, the, let's say, 2 weeks we passed from the receiving of the PO letter to the departure time, because I told to all my family members. At that time in Italy, the lockdown was was pass. I mean, people could move, could go around. Was also late June, so people go to beach and so on. Said, look, we spent 4 months close at home. Now we will spend 2 weeks more. Forget about see friends. We just met. I mean, my parents, my close relative, no one else, because I was too concerned to have any issue for the last check of the test, the COVID-19 test before leaving. I said, if we lose this chance, we will never get back. So stay at home, enjoy between us 2 weeks more. And unfortunately, I mean, in 5 months' time, I didn't even meet my closest friends. Before the lockdown and after, really, the concern of being able to come back.
Yeah, that's quite the experience, but certainly I'd say the right call to treat it as to be more on the conservative side of that. So speaking of having to spend 2 weeks indoors, not seeing people, all three of us went through our own respective hotel quarantine experiences. Again, I was sort of one of the first people to have to go through this back in mid-March. And the process from between landing in Beijing International Airport and walking into my hotel room took 12 hours because it was literally brand new procedures. But I'm kind of curious, what was the process like once you landed in China to getting into your quarantine? What was the experience like for people who haven't had to experience this yet but might have to when they return?
Well, I have to say that since we were so excited to get back, we have definitely a good attitude and mood also to face things that we were expecting to happen. And in the same time, I would say that things were even nicer than we expected. We knew that we have to go through procedure in some way quite invasive for people, to meet people dressing up as we were coming, I don't know from where, because we were infected and so on. But I have to say that from the time we landed, we did all the procedure. We had also around 40 minutes trip by bus, and we get into the hotel, get out from the plane, get into hotel in 3 hours time. We have a small group, 135 people, not so large, but so was quite nice. The hotel life was okay. We were all together, first of all, very important. We enjoyed a little bit bigger room for 4 people, was quite okay. Room was not so clean, but we find the way out to do it by our own. And then again, I mean, quarantine for us was not an issue, because we perfectly know the time we were getting in and the time we were getting out. So we have a calendar and we pick every day, which was exactly the opposite situation. We live in Italy when we don't know nothing about tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So it was, an experience that we live, warming up for the time in which we will be able to get out from the hotel. Yeah.
And Carl, what about yourself? What was your quarantine experience like?
If I may, I'd actually like to roll back a bit, Jacob, and just talk about the process from when the visa was awarded to me to actually leaving. So, I mean, the PU letter arrived in mid to late June. I didn't actually receive the visa until the 28th of July, so it's over a month later. I think one of the things that people probably need to understand if they're about to come back is the process that you need to go through from being told when you can collect your visa and what you then need to go through in order to be able to get your flight. So the requirement is that you have to have a negative COVID test that was the results, or rather the sample needs to have been taken within 5 days of you flying. So the timing is actually fairly tight. So I was told that I could come and pick up my visa on the Tuesday morning, which meant that I needed to have a COVID test by then. This was on the Friday. I was then given a list of around 15 approved clinics in Hong Kong, government-approved clinics that were allowed to do the testing that would be recognized by the visa center, which I then just started phoning through. I spent the entire afternoon phoning. Many of them didn't answer. A couple of them said that they might be able to fit me in for an appointment in October. Eventually, I managed to go through a previous clinic that I'd gone to for my first COVID test when I was actually submitting my application, and through some fairly strong begging on my behalf and explaining my situation and sounding pretty exasperated, and at the end of my tether, one of the people that I spoke to finally agreed that if I went in on the Saturday and I submitted a sample to him before 5 o'clock, they would try their very best to get it back to me, get the results back to me by Monday evening, which meant that I would then be able to take it on the Tuesday morning for my application. But at that point, he wouldn't promise anything, despite the fact that it cost me another 1,500 Hong Kong dollars for the privilege. As it turned out, they did get the result to me on time. I was able to go and make my appointment with the visa centre and collect my visa. But then, of course, you needed to be able to get a flight within, so it's not within 5 days of receiving the visa, it's within 5 days of when you submitted your sample. So considering that I submitted my sample 4:30 on Saturday, it meant that I had to fly before 4:30 the following Thursday. Unfortunately, Hong Kong flights to Beijing are quite limited. I think at that point, they were only running 2 flights per week. The next flight that I would have been able to take would have been the Friday, which would have exceeded the time limit. So I ended up having to fly to Shanghai. So hence I ended up getting into Pudong Airport, joining a long train of people, being seen by a series of people in hazmat suits who were checking documentation, getting you to scan various codes, verifying your health status. And then, of course, you had to have yet another COVID test, which was a first for me, that they did a swab of the nasal passages, which I definitely don't recommend to anybody. We were then taken to a holding area based on which was your final destination. So all people that were eventually going to go to Beijing were put into a certain area. And after, I'd say, maybe an hour's wait, we were herded onto buses and we were taken to a hotel somewhere way north of Pudong. I didn't have family with me, maybe a blessing or a curse, I'm not sure. But yeah, I did my time as best I could. I got through the fairly repetitive and not great food as best that I could. I was ordering in fresh fruit from a local market, which obviously helped a lot. And I was in contact with people still, people in the office and my family and friends, which obviously helped as well. And I was finally released from quarantine on the 13th of August. I then got back to Beijing. I'm sorry this is a bit long, but it has been something of a trial. I got back to Beijing finally on the 15th of August, and I had been told that I would need to do 7 days quarantine. This is not a Beijing-wide regulation. This is purely based on your community that you live in. My community have decided that if you're coming back from having done 2 weeks quarantine in another city in China, you still need to do 7 days home quarantine. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get into my home to go and live there because I'd had some water damage due to a burst pipe, which had happened some months ago. I'm not sure exactly when. And the kitchen was covered in mold, which obviously had to then be redone. So I've actually spent the last several days in a hotel in Beijing, still waiting for my flat to be fit to live in. So yeah, 21st of August was actually my first day back in the office. It's been quite a journey.
Yeah, quite the journey indeed. And for those who are kind of coming after you, what would be your top 1 or 2 tips, for quarantine? What things would you recommend that people bring or prepare for?
The main advice is if you have anything that you like, if you need chocolate to warm up and to have a better mood along the loneliness of your quarantine or something like that, please care about it and bring it with you together with the most, personal stuff that you love to have together. Yeah.
Yeah, I was quite lucky. Every time I come back from my hometown, I always bring my favorite coffee beans from my favorite coffee place, and 2 bottles of my favorite bourbon from my favorite local distillery.
This is not allowed because we were said and was written that you can't bring alcohol, but I was said by other people that the control maybe sometimes it's not so deep, but I don't know. What I can tell you is that according to the regulation, it seems it's not allowed.
I think one of the things that I probably should have done and didn't was to prepare a little bit more for the period from getting off the plane to actually getting to the quarantine place. There was nowhere to get water, for example. And I think altogether with the testing, the waiting for the bus, it was around about 2.5, 3 hours. and I could have done with some water in that time. So maybe having a couple of bottles of water would be good preparation. For the quarantine itself, I would say try and find out which hotel you're going to stay in and if they allow deliveries, because I know that some people that have done quarantine weren't allowed to order things from outside. But it's randomly assigned as far as I know. So I think it's just potluck as far as that is concerned. To do the time effectively, I think one of my recommendations would be to get a fairly strict routine and to stick to it. Find exercises that you can do, exercises that are possible within the space that you have. Get as much reading material as you can. I was also very lucky in that the Wi-Fi in my room was actually pretty solid. And I was able to use my personal VPN to stream things. So I had that sort of level of familiarity to make me feel a little bit more at home, which I think really, really does help at times.
And the one last thing that I would add as a tip is to try to check if your room has a window facing the outside. Unfortunately, after I walked into my room, I learned that it was an atrium-facing window. So for 14 days, I did not get to see outside, and I just got to watch elevators go up and down. If I had even thought of that, I certainly would have asked, because the hotel was not yet filled up, for a room with an outside-facing window. So something to keep in mind. Have a look at your hotel ahead of time, and think about all these little things. Okay, any final thoughts, final comments from our guests?
Not really.
Not really. Just to say, again, now the procedure are much more relaxed. There is much more chance to get back to China for people who has a resident permit, and so has the right to get back into the country where they live, where they work. So the quarantine is just the last, step. It's not easy step, but really, when you think back of what you experienced in the month before, you will be happy to enjoy the quarantine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I think actually it may sound a little bit unusual, but I'd say this has been probably the most stressful time of my life. And I think anybody we know that things can change very quickly. It seems like things are improving now, in that there are 36 European countries that are now listed. And if you're from one of those countries or living in one of those countries, you no longer need the PU letter. So essentially, that should make the whole process a lot easier, but we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We do know that things can change very quickly, and we do know that when things change quickly, China acts quickly. And if there is another shutdown to take place, it could happen within 24 hours notice, as happened before. So I'd say that if you're embarking on this process of trying to come back, you need to really try to maintain a positive outlook as best you can. Learn some relaxation techniques, because you may need to find some depths of patience that you maybe didn't know that you had.
Unfortunately, we see the number in Europe growing up. This is not a good signal. But in meantime, we have a procedure in China for quarantine, which maybe allow you just to have 1 week in hotel and then 1 week at home. So get the chance as soon as you can, and looking forward to meet you in China again.
Excellent. Well, thanks to both of our guests for their insights and their sharing of their experiences. I think our listeners will really appreciate it. And thank you for being our first guests on our first episode of this podcast. All right. In conclusion, for our first episode of the European Chamber podcast, we're going to preview our next episode, which will be about the upcoming European Chamber's position paper, an annual production of ours. Tom, could you give us a quick introduction? What is the position paper?
Yeah, of course. So members of ours, what the position paper is, as they have assisted us in writing it every year, is basically a yearly summary of the major issues that each and every working group of ours face in when doing business in China. Working groups have looked into the existing issues and seen what the Chinese government can do in order to address them and make the business environment in China a better one. We're going to launch it the 10th of September, and we're all very excited about that. We'll be discussing some of the content of it in our next podcast.
Yeah, so you have that to look forward to. For those brave enough to try to read the whole thing, it's about 400 pages long with about 800 recommendations across the different working groups. So, and we should have the European Chamber's president, Jörg Wuttke, as our guest for that show, and he'll be introducing some of the main themes and overarching issues that we present in the position paper. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much.